Hello. My name is Funk McLovin. You may recognize me from the many videos I've released over the years. This video is a continuation of the one I recently did on aspects from Homestuck. This video is about class. In a future video, I will discuss them together and how to diagnose them in a video about class spects. Watching the other two is not a prerequisite to this video. To those coming from the 2025 SOCCON Winter Showcase, hello, welcome to the new year and welcome to my channel. During the video, we will discuss class, first from a canonical perspective, then view other analysts' ideas, until we finally synthesize everything into something new. There will be several times through this video when a long list of classes is explored one by one. During these times, take a moment to think about which class you're most excited to see discussed, but also think about a class that you may never have thought about before. If you would like a podcast version of this video while you're driving or doing the dishes or whatever the hell you do, I've made one available for free on Patreon, as well as a text version, which are both available in the description of this video. Class specting has been a part of Homestuck since its very beginning. Homestuck's core appeal has always been a fandom playground, a place people can go to make their own fan trolls and creations on the works, and class specting is one of the most mysterious elements to that end. 12 aspects and 14 classes to sort Homestuck's characters into, like Hogwarts houses or bending elements, except more vague and conceptual. There's never been a codified list of classes or a quiz to sort prospective readers into classes, unlike the 2014 Extended Zodiac, which sorts characters into aspects. This left theorists like Optimistic Duelist and Dewdrop to speculate more heavily about them, and as such, class looms large over discussions of class spect. Compared to the more orthodox aspect dualism, class is something like a free-for-all, taking the canonical words from Calliope and Andrew himself and extrapolating them into fascinating new theories. In the year 2025, though, things are different. Theorists are quiet. There is little discussion about these things. There are still some dedicated discussions going on, shout out to the Homestuck Discord's class spect containment thread, but broad scope pieces haven't been released in some time. What I have noticed the most from people discussing class spect, especially class, is an assumption that class is in some way formulaic or direct. Recently I asked on Twitter, is Jesus a sylph? And while all of the answers I got were very thoughtful and interesting, some of them were mired in reductionist thoughts, from mentions that muses and sylphs are often women, or talk of how Jesus is too active to be a sylph. In other words, discussion seems to be mired in what limits someone in terms of their class, instead of what a class can open up and tell us about them. The fact of the matter is, up until now, discussion of class has been stiflingly limited. No matter how far I went with my research, I found people only willing to explain geometric configurations of classes into categories and systems instead of discussing class more openly. For every mention of Carl Jung, there was a failure to explain in depth how these theories related to extant psychology and analysis. This is the shackle that I wish to break, the shackle of simple illusion and straightforward categorization. Enter a world of myth and legend. There are more things than passive and active. Let me show them to you. Before we dive ass first into the sucking void, let's make sure the diving board isn't going to snap off here, okay? What is a class? We use that word a lot, and you probably have some concept in your brain, but let's take a moment to wrestle that word into submission and make it tell us its secrets. Class, reflexively speaking, is the name given to the group of classes, which number 14. Muse, Lord, Bard, Prince, Rogue, Thief, Page, Heir, Mage, Maid, Seer, Witch, Knight, and Sylph. More on these in specific terms soon, but for now understand them as pieces of ourselves and pieces of the characters in the collective consciousness. Classes, much like the archetypes of the tarot or in Jungian psychology, are the unitary components of selfhood. In other words, the pre-existing, cross-cultural templates for us to import into our own lives and behavior. In simpler terms, they are blueprints we see in stories that tell us how to act. Each class is a monosyllabic archetype taken from myth and legend, the broad anachronistic pre-modernity of our minds. Jobs like page and knight aren't around anymore, and beings like muses and sylphs are of myth. They are the building blocks of self and character, bridging the gap between literature and psychology. Imagine each class as it exists as a faceless, nameless character, a character we, through the acts in our lives, consciously and unconsciously attempt to recreate. When our boss pisses us off and we steal some staplers, we are the righteous rogue. When a parent dies and bequeaths us a rare baseball card collection, we are heirs. When we type a Twitter thread defending our wives from the hateful mobs, we are knights. You get the idea. Even though we may embody part of a class at different times, our lives have classes that overarch them. When we say we are a class, we are saying that we most closely resemble one of the 14 archetypes in some way, to the point that we can be mistaken as them. We begin to try to actively emulate them, to construct moral systems to make us more like them. Being a class is acting like a class. Great. We know what class is now, but here's a better question. What is a class? As previously discussed, aspects in Homestuck are like music in many different ways, each one ripe for analysis. If aspects are the music theory in a vacuum, the classes are much more like the musical instruments, the instrument or method with which the characters and people use these aspects. A class, linguistically speaking, is attached to a person somehow, used both as title and name in and of itself. Characters are addressed as which or air more than space or void. This means that a class is attached to a person, but the aspect is not. The aspect is something else that a person gains access to, much like someone using an instrument gains access to music they have not had in and of themselves. The question is, how intrinsic is class? In other words, do people choose their classes, or are classes inborn into people? Nurture or nature? In Homestuck, class is predetermined, but predetermination in Homestuck isn't necessarily indicative of intrinsic nature. In Homestuck, though predestination occurs, free will still exists because you still have to choose to do certain predestined things. You can choose not to, you'll just die in a doomed timeline. If this is true, that predetermination exists in step with free will, it means that people neither choose their class nor have it inborn. It means that people have a class that their free will naturally leads them into, a cosmic choice they make subconsciously. For a real-world example of such a trait, take Albert Einstein. Einstein, of his own free will, became a famous scientist. The fact that he is a scientist is the result of his free will, but it is just as much an intrinsic part of his being, because since he is dead, he is unable to become something else. Nikola Tesla was and always would have been an inventor, Marie Curie did and always would have discovered radiation, and Shakira did and always would have written Hips Don't Lie. Just in this way, John was and will always be the heir of breath, Dave was and will always be the knight of time, etc. Could a character's class change over time? I think it would depend on what kind of character or person they are and how much about them remains to be known. For example, it would be difficult to identify John's classpect very early in Homestuck's story, since he does not exhibit many breath or air-related traits other than minor things. Going back to the Einstein example, it would be difficult to tell early in his life that he was going to become a scientist. There might be evidence, like perhaps he got good grades in math or science class, but his potential is hard to identify. Class is only easy to identify retroactively, taking a broad swath of factors into consideration, just like a profession or a quality would be hard to identify proactively. This means that a class must be analyzed with a totality of a character's story in mind. Applying class to a character necessarily applies a degree of predestination and immutability to them. Was Dave always a knight? Did Shakira's hips never lie? In summary, class is a complex and holistic analysis of a character into a fluid set of traits or behaviors that is further complicated by their relation to aspects. This implies numerous things. First, class is possibly malleable. Just as there are many diverse musical instruments, there may be diverse classes past that of aspects. Second, class is possibly transient. Just as someone can learn one instrument or another, one might be able to learn a class. This fits with other classes in video games. Third, class is possibly mutable. A character's class could change over their story. There is textual evidence for this. Finally, a class is possibly subjective. In other words, it is possible that unlike aspects, classes do not represent Platonic ideals of nature, but instead social and societal constructs. Most existing analysis is devoted to the idea of passivity and activity in classes. This idea is suggested to us textually by Calliope. This is unlike the previous aspect video, where most canonical information came from the extended Zodiac and fan theorists. Now, a character within the actual text is acting as fan theorist. Meta. Calliope specifically is an interesting character to give us this information, and has certain important biases that come with the information she gives us, biases that we should deconstruct. What does Callie have to say about class? Between her discussions with Roxy and Dirk, we get some information from her about what a class is as it pertains to both of them. She reveals Dirk and Roxy's classes to them and explains those classes in the context of other classes, referring to passive, plus, and active, minus, classes, and their traits. She defines this delineation as active, minus, as exploitative for themselves, and passive, plus, allow their aspect to benefit others. She does say, however, that the distinction can mean various things. Here is her quote on the screen. Later, she also defines class as having counterparts, and defines thief and rogue, as well as bard and prince, as opposites, but doesn't inform us of any others. She also mentions certain verbiage that active classes destroy their aspect. Dirk, a prince of heart, equates this as his aspect means he is a destroyer of soul. There's another quote on screen. And finally, Callie also mentions the gendered nature of class, with the final quote on screen. While it would be disingenuous to dismiss Calliope entirely, her information is meant to be understood as revelatory more about her as much as about class. In other words, what is she telling the reader about herself in these passages? She makes a big deal about the active-passive dichotomy, which is meant to reflect her relationship with Caliborn. To her, someone who is embodied in a struggle for her own autonomy with a destructive personality, it's easy to see why she should rationalize class as a form of dichotomy. She's trying to construct a narrative about her own struggles. In practice, while there are active and passive moments from various characters, there are moments when characters act outside of this dichotomy. Roxy, for instance, a passive rogue, is instrumental in defying the Condus and actually strikes the killing blow. In Act 5, Rose goes grimdark and attacks Jack Noir, a passive seer, using highly offensive and destructive magic. Dirk Strider, an active destroyer, is soft-spoken and often lays low in favor of taking action, preferring plans and schemes. Comparing Dirk and Roxy, we see two characters who act very similarly in terms of their abilities. Both of them lay low and gather information before striking. Then they act on behalf of their friends and loved ones instead of out of selfishness. How can we call either of them passive or active at all? It seems very reductive. Next, we have Calliope's claim of gendered distinction. In spite of my initial rejection, this seems cogent in a social sense. In real life, a maid is generally considered a feminine job, whereas a prince is a male-gendered term. However, this distinction is not as ironclad as it makes it seem. In fiction, some terms like prince are sometimes subverted. Like in the Vampire the Masquerade mythology, prince is a gender-neutral term for ruler. It is more accurate to say that gendered classes have gendered associations, like professions in the real world, like nurse and teacher being feminine, in spite of sometimes being held by men. It's arbitrary, but there exists some bias. In other words, there could easily be a male maid, but it might seem odd to those around them who exist inside of a certain social order. What I mean by all this is we should not consider Calliope's analysis to be wrong, just incomplete. Much like Shakira's hips, Callie doesn't lie, but there is more to the story. In a now archived Reddit AMA, Hussey answered some questions related to class. His answers shed more light on class and broadly align with Calliope's analysis with more nuance. Here's a quote. You could also look to the passive-active nature of the classes in making some retroactive sense of the Durst-Prospect-Dreamer duality. Passive-active classes are a pretty vague thing, and don't resolve so easily into simple dualities like defensive and offensive and such. There's more to the quote, but I'll continue. As stated before, though Callie offers a more rigid system, Hussey seems to take the active-passive dichotomy as more vague or even arbitrary. Hussey has more information relating to the Durst and Prospect to the active-passive dichotomy. More on Durst and Prospect later on. Unfortunately, Hussey doesn't give the audience much directly, but the lack of authorial information can actually tell us a great deal about Hussey's intent. It doesn't seem like something he put a particular amount of thought into, other than the general theming and structure. It's something he refers to as hyper-flexible. To me, this says that as an author, the system is meant to be vague and ill-defined purposefully in order to allow people to fill in the gaps themselves. That's why Callie didn't give us all the information about every class, just 2 of them. As such, analysis of class is less about trying to decipher what Hussey intended and more about constructing a system from the intentionally scant evidence, like a connect the dots with the numbers removed. You can make any picture you like. Optimistic Duelist's analysis videos, Hero Title, Parts 2 and 3, cover class, mostly the active-passive system, using much the same evidence as stated above, Andrew Hussey and Calliope. Mainly, OD sets the tone for most analysis that came later, with 3 main takeaways. 1, a connection to the psychoanalysis of Carl Jung. 2, an active-passive dichotomy with strong opposites, much like there are strong opposites in their aspect system. And 3, inversion theory, that each class has a contemporary and opposite class. In the previous aspect video, I railed against dualism, but dualism has more precedent in class, since Calliope and Hussey both explicitly state an active-passive dichotomy at play somehow. OD pairs each class into 7 groups, each of which has a passive and active expression. For instance, seers and mages are both magicians and prophets, but mages are active and seers are passive. The justification and evidence for each pairing, however, is lacking other than in intuition. Unlike aspects, which got confirmed geometric wheel arrangement, only a scant few classes have confirmed opposites, like Lord, Muse, Bard, Prince, and Rogue, Thief. The question for any theorist is, where are they drawing the necessary extrapolations in their systems from? If all of the active-passive sets aren't defined, how does one identify them? In OD's case, they draw from real-world examples in mythologies, such as tarot and archetype theory. This is all well and good, and leads us to a deeper understanding. But what can we do better? I discussed the first half of Ouroboristas' video in my previous aspect video, so I'll address the other half now. Ouro's theory of class seems to mirror OD's, but the method they use to extrapolate missing information is very different. They compare class not to Jungian archetypes, but to role-playing in a story. A particularly poignant example of how class relates to aspect is how they describe the difference between a fireman and an arsonist, with 2 vastly differing approaches to the same aspect. In this hypothetical case, fire, the fireman destroys fire and the arsonist creates it, but you could conceive of them as having the same aspect. Like OD, their class symmetries exist along a passive and active line, but unlike OD, their opposites are described not using intuition, but using the verbiage of each class. For instance, they pair princes and bards as those who destroy. They pair maids and knights as those who serve. Critically, OD and Ouro come to different conclusions about the actual symmetries. They pair different classes. In OD systems, knights are paired with pages, for instance. Again, something feels lacking. Ouro mentions that other symmetries in class could exist, which invites the notion that undermines their and OD's analysis, namely that if symmetries can't be codified reliably, there cannot be a system of symmetry at all. How can we say which class is which class's inverse? In Dewdrop's class spec brochure, by far the meat of their analysis is in class. There are some things that are beyond the scope of this analysis for now, such as the fan classes that they have invented, as well as certain notions about gendered classes that I disagree with for reasons listed above. Much like OD and Oro, they have a notion of verbing in class, in other words, analyzing a class through the lens that each class has a discrete set of verbs that define it. Calliope's example is that princes destroy, and similar verbiage can be applied to other classes. Like OD and Oro, they organize the 14 classes into 7 pairs, each given an overarching title. They make certain pairs that differ from OD and Oro, such as combining knights and pages into servants, but also pairing maids and sylphs as fae. Also like OD and Oro, they are scant with textual evidence, but their pairs do pass the intuition test as well as scrutiny. Unlike OD and Oro, Dewdrop treats the idea of class inversion differently than the passive-active dichotomy. An inversion isn't necessarily the aspect that it is passive-active counterpart. For instance, Dewdrop pairs princes and bards as an active-passive counterpart, but pairs princes and sylphs as inversions. Also unlike OD and Oro, Dewdrop has an exhaustive section on how certain classes can seem like other classes, role-playing falsely as them. All in all, the picture Dewdrop paints is one that has a very strong notion of a true self that is sometimes difficult to identify. They class spec their friends and peers through the work and attribute certain characteristics to them that are emblematic, especially when it comes to class. Though I do appreciate Dew's commitment to a more complex and thorough analysis, there is emphasis put on the trueness of the system that feels somewhat backwards. Essentially, there is an unspoken question in most of class analysis. Do we control our class, or does our class control us? The latter seems to be true to most existing analysis to some extent, not only for Dewdrop, but more significantly in their case. I asked before, in a system that requires extrapolation for things that aren't explained in the comic, we need to get our extrapolation from somewhere. But what exists already in the comic that we don't need to extrapolate? Each class in Homestuck has certain representatives who we can glean information from. Some are more represented than others, which reflect the real-world quizzes on class, which makes me believe that the distribution of class isn't necessarily symmetrical. In other words, there are more seers than mages, and of those seers, they make more of an impact on Homestuck's story. By analyzing each representative and drawing similarities between them, we can more accurately identify what classes look like and how they are embodied. The following is a list of all of the classes in Homestuck with all of the representatives. Lord, Caliborn, Muse, Calliope. These two have one representative, so they are the most difficult to talk about, since there is no parallax between them and other characters. They are the master classes, which in many ways are superior to the other classes. This implies that not all classes are equal. Most specifically, both classes are associated with massive, overwhelming power. Lords through force, muses through influence.
Witches. Jade, Damara, and Pfeffery. Witches are all loners who have staggering powers. They aren't necessarily in the spotlight, overshadowed by others, but never overshadowed in power. Dangerous, but reliable. Witches are a force to be reckoned with.
Rogues. Rufio, Roxy, and Nepeta. Rogues are often lonely and often outside the social norm. Roxy and Nepeta both live alone and help their friends in ways that their friends don't necessarily ask for. They work alone, but they work for others. They're often misunderstood, but always try their best to be helpful. Heirs. John, Michuna, and Equius. Heirs are possibly the most diverse bunch. They're individuals in their own little worlds, but simultaneously help others immensely. They let the story happen to them, rather than actively seek out the story, but they still have a massive impact upon it. They're intuitive and don't question their own taste. Like John and Equius have legendarily bad heart taste. Seers. Rose, Cancri, and Terezi. Seers never shut the fuck up. They're opinionated talkers and observers who often take drastic action when they need to. They're instrumental in what they see as the big picture, sometimes to their detriment. Seers look like weirdos to those around them, but are undeniable. Mages. Solix and Mulin. Mages are wise old hermits. They're stuck in their ways, uninterested in things that don't align with their predispositions. Their predispositions are usually right, though. They know what's coming. They know what's what, and they're ambivalent about sharing it, but to those they open up to, they are beloved. Maids, Jane, Porim, and Aradia. Maids serve others. This is because they are passive people who require others to make use of them. They don't always like to serve, but when they do, they are passionate and powerful. Maid has wordplay with maid, which has the impression that they are made of their aspect, and have inexhaustible reserves of it. Knights. Dave, Karkat, and Latula. Knights are similar to maids in that they are powerful and serve others, but they do so on their own power and autonomy. They're protectors, powerful and acute, but often blinkered, and have a tendency for workaholism. They pay the price. Sylphs, Arania and Kanaya. Sylphs are meddlers of the highest order. They believe they know what is right, and they're often correct. They are single-minded in fixing problems and have issues with black-and-white mentality. They are often healers, but they are not demure and methodical like doctors. They often have good and bad sides.
Pages. Tavros, Jake, and Horus. Page is most likely the most difficult class. They're defined by potential for change, but seldom get to enact that change. They're the most powerful in service of others, usually by coercion. They're defined, unlike any other class, by a lack. They have a great deal of growing to do.
Princes. Dirk, Eridan, and Kurlos. Princes, like pages, are fundamentally defined by their ambitions and skills. They are driven, opinionated, devoted, and forceful. They like having power, and they like using it. They are straightforward outwardly, but usually have deeply turbulent inner lives. Bards, Cronus, and Gamzee. Bards are unassuming, but influential. They're incapable of not being true to themselves for better or worse, often worse. Because of this whimsy, they are unreliable and often antagonistic, but always powerful and always impactful. Thieves, Mina and Vriska. Thieves are singular, maligned, loners who have delusions of grandeur. They are fighters and strugglers. Their willpower is unstoppable. While sometimes bad at teamwork, they're often the only ones who can see through the bullshit. This is suitable for a definition of each class, and already we can see similarities and patterns forming. Using this information, let's see what we can dream up. Using this canon knowledge, we have a baseline understanding of each class and the job they do. Linguistically, what do these classes have in common? They're all anachronistic, but they generally refer to a vague past. All the professions named as classes are archaic ones. No one is a knight or a seer in this day and age. They harken back to a mythological time of monarchy and fable. They all relate back to something bigger, something ancient, each one having a different place with respect to each other. Imagine each class relating to an imaginary king who rules over them. The king represents authority and power, and each class relates to it differently. The king could stand in for a class's aspect, their story, or a specific character who they find influential. The king is the want and the drive in all of us. The king could also be conceptualized as a conductor to further the music metaphor from the previous video. For instance, how may a thief react to a king? It may see him as a tyrant or a treasure trove. A page might see a king as an aspirational and awe-inspiring figure. A prince may see their king jealously as someone in the way of their ambitions. Classes all take their names from antique archetypes, but each one has a different role. Lunar sway presumably affects the class a great deal. Broadly speaking, lunar sway is more straightforward than class, each one having to do with a person's or character's relation to a positive or negative emotion. In Homestuck, every character who awakens to a moon likes being there, so we can assume the moon we prefer is the one that holds our sway. More specifically, Prospit is associated with positive emotions, fairness, good society, and order, where Durst is associated with negative emotions, survival, bad society, and chaos. Each of the 14 classes, then, has a total of 28 possible permutations, 14 classes with 2 possible lunar sways each. In Homestuck, classes sometimes tend to result in like sway, but not always. For example, Nepeta and Roxy are rogues, both hailing from Durst. The pages Tavros and Jake hail from Prospit. This is not always the case, like with the thieves Vriska and Mina being from Prophet and Durst respectively. This means that some classes could lean one way or the other, but the 28 permutations still exist. Taking sway with class, we can call this the subclass. Not all 28 subclasses are represented in the work of Homestuck, so some of the descriptions will be informed by extrapolation. However, these descriptions will be as general as possible in order to preserve the idea that two characters with like classes, or even like classpects, could look very, very different. Prospit Lord. No in-text examples. A Prospit Lord at his best is an ambitious character who wishes to topple an unjust king. The Prospit Lord will work tirelessly because he believes he is the leader the world needs. His ultimate goal is to topple the king and rule in peace. A Prospit Lord at his worst is a spiteful, self-righteous despot, rewriting the rules in his favor. His ultimate goal is to topple the king and weed out what he sees as evil. Durst Lord. Example, Caliborn. A Durst Lord at his best is a fierce and totalizing force of nature who steers the world in a new order. The Durst Lord will move mountains to affirm their own ego. His ultimate goal is to kill the king and rule in his place. Most change their ego to suit the world. The Durst Lord changes the world to suit their ego. At their worst, the Durst Lord is bitter, petty, spiteful, and worst of all, supremely powerful. They are a fussing, crying baby on a cosmic scale. His ultimate goal is to kill the king and raise the kingdom. Prospit Muse. Example, Calliope. A Prospit Muse at her best is an astute chronicler and totalizing influence. The Prospit Muse catalogues everything she sees and doesn't miss a detail. No one can escape her absolute knowledge. Her ultimate goal is to steer the king to a better world. The Prospit Muse at her worst is a mistress of misinformation, using her privileged knowledge to skew truth itself. Her ultimate goal is to subsume the power of the king entirely, like a puppet. Durst Muse. No in-text examples. A Durst Muse at her best is seductive and charming spirit, giving and taking power as she pleases. She is everywhere. She is always watching. Her ultimate goal is to make the king want precisely what she wants. A Durst Muse at her worst is a petulant and vengeful beast who cannot only destroy reputations, but force her enemies into evil. Her ultimate goal is to poison the king. Prospit Witch. Example, Jade. A Prospit Witch at her best is a cheerful and helpful scion of power. Reliable, trustworthy, and lovable, she can change the very winds. Her ultimate goal is to serve the king using her magic. A Prospit Witch at her worst is dejected, depressed, a liability. Her powers are too dangerous, too extreme. It cannot be trusted.
Her ultimate goal is to hide away from the king who persecutes her. Witch. Examples: Pfefferi, Demara. A Witch at her best is friendly but jaded individual. She knows what's what, and she doesn't take any crap. She's powerful, and she knows how dangerous she can be. Her ultimate goal is to serve the king's court with a measured hand. A Witch at her worst is paralyzed and scared. She fears her own power and cannot solve her own problems. Her ultimate goal is to run from the king's forces.
Prospect rogues. Example: Rufio. A prospect rogue at her best is merry and sly, cunning and skeptical. She gently leads people into realizing the contradictions in their lives and give excellent advice. Her ultimate goal is to steal from the king. A prospect rogue at her worst is spiteful and vindictive, slighted by the world, justifying her misdeeds as she goes. Her ultimate goal is to undermine the king. Rogues. Example: Roxy and Nepeta. A rogue at her best is cunning and sweet, chronically on the run, and a loner. She's rejected by others but takes it on the chin and eventually finds her clan. Her ultimate goal is to take from the king and give to her friends. A rogue at her worst is a depressed loner without hope or prospects. She lives only to be hunted. Her goal is to flee from the king. Prospect heirs. Examples: John and Matuna. Prospect heir at their best are living their true lives. They love what they love without apology and would do anything to protect it. Their ultimate goal is to eventually replace the king. Prospect heirs at their worst are confused and lost. Their choices have led them astray and they feel alone. They don't know how to get out of the woods. Their ultimate goal is to find the king. Heirs. Examples: Matuna and Equius. Heirs at their best are shrewd and stalwart. They're enthralled by their own power and wish to use it for good, but they realize there's a lot wrong with the world. Often misled, they're trying to make things better. Their ultimate goal is to be better than the king. At their worst, heirs are vindictive and vengeful, seeing the bad in the world without a cure, often lashing out. Their ultimate goal is to surpass their king. Prospect seers. Examples: Terezi and Cancri. Prospect seers at their best are masters of debate and philosophy. They know where things ought to be going, and they will advise accordingly. Their goal is to counsel the king. Prospect seers at their worst are disillusioned cynics who despise the world's order and offer critique without prompting. Their goal is to undermine the king's propaganda. Seers. Example: Rose Lalonde. Seers at their best are tacticians of the highest pedigree. They know what's coming and are planning 5 steps ahead. They don't let emotions cloud their judgment, but are also paradoxically prone to outbursts of anger. Their goal is to strategize the king's armies. At their worst, seers are wrathful schemers who don't care who gets poisoned if they get what they want. Their goal is to win the king's favor for personal gain. Prospect mages. Example: Solix. At their best, prospect mages are serene hermits who dispense guidance to those who ask for it. They don't seek pupils and are often cryptic, but their power and guidance are undeniable. Their ultimate goal is to steer the king. At their worst, mages are embittered by life and wish to be alone. They withdraw and fail to share their wisdom. Their ultimate goal is to cut ties with the king. Mages. Examples: Solix, Mulin. At their best, mages are behind-the-scenes workers who engineer the very fabric of reality as it is known. They work in the shadows to bring around the change they desire. Their goal is to influence the king through his kingdom. At their worst, they are chronic puppet masters who think they hold all the cards. Their goal is to control the king through subterfuge. Prospect maids. Examples: Jane Crocker, Porem Merriam. At their best, prospect maids are obedient and diligent, working tirelessly for what is right. They work for themselves, first and foremost. Their goal is to serve their king. At their worst, prospect maids are beleaguered and exhausted workaholics who have spite for those who they serve and never get thanks. Their goal is to earn praise for their king. Durst maids. Example, Aradia Megiddo. At their best, Durst maids anticipate the needs of those around them and fall into a role of a silent helper. They know you better than you know you. Their goal is to do the king's dirty work. At their worst, Durst maids are dejected and rejected, resented by those they serve. Their goal is to earn their king's respect. Prospect knights. Examples, Carcat Vantus Latula Pyrope. Prospect knights at their best are incapable of being facetious. They wear their hearts on their sleeves, and though their incredible earnestness, they win over others. Their goal is to fight for their king. At their worst, prospect knights are full of vindictive rage that doesn't go anywhere but at themselves and their peers. They don't get no respect. Their goal is to win the king's honor. Durst knights. Example, Dave Strider. Durst knights at their best are quiet protectors and effective servants. They would rather not fight at all, but they don't have the option. Their ultimate goal is to protect their king. At their worst, Durst knights are depressed and impotent. Without a reason to fight, they have nothing. Their ultimate goal is to find their king. Prospect sylphs. Example, Kanaya Merriam. Arania Circuit. Prospect sylphs at their best are intuitive listeners who always give the best advice. They're humble but have a reputation as meddlers and blowhards. Their goal is to advise the king. Prospect sylphs at their worst make dangerous designs and plan revenge. Their unchecked inner turmoil explodes outward. Their ultimate goal is to undermine the king who has slighted them. Durst sylphs. No in-text examples. Durst sylphs at their best are sardonic healers who aren't afraid of the ravages of battle. Seeing them when you're in trouble is a relief, but they're prone to I-told-you-sos. Their goal is to keep the king healthy. Durst sylphs at their worst are vindictive wielders of poison. Doctors, too, use knives. Their goal is to poison the king. Prospect pages. Examples, Jake English, Tavros Nitrum. Prospect pages at their best are humble and ravenous for adventure. They're willing to put in the work to better themselves and do the right thing. Their goal is to impress the king. Prospect pages at their worst are dejected, depressed, and impotent. Without power, they cannot act. Their goal is to escape the king's dungeon. Durst pages. Horus. Durst pages are eager to prove themselves, to do deeds and feats and impress their own sense of justice. They're somewhat blinkered, but mean well. Their goal is to win the king's tournament. Durst pages at their worst wield rage impotently and miserably. They're exhausting to even be around. Their ultimate goal is to strike at a king who ignores them. Prospect princes. Kurlos Makara. Prospect princes at their best have a powerful sense of right and wrong. If might makes right, then the just must be mighty. They cannot be dissuaded or corrupted. Their goal is to be worthy to inherit the king's kingdom. Prospect princes at their worst are jaded and angry, striking out in ways where the ends justify the means. Their ultimate goal is to prove the king wrong about them. Durst princes. Examples, Eridan Ampera, Dirk Strider. Durst princes at their best are servants to their people and incorruptible leaders. They know how the sausage gets made and aren't afraid to get their hands dirty, fighting on the front lines. Their ultimate goal is to right the wrongs of the king. Durst princes at their worst are violent and blind, chasing down windmills. Their ultimate goal is to rebel against their king. Prospect bards. Example, Gamzee Makara. Prospect bards at their best are friendly and helpful. Not always reliable, but never afraid. Their goal is to entertain the king. Prospect bards at their worst are sharp-tongued and cruel. They're the roadrunner being hunted by the coyote. Never ends well for the coyote. Their ultimate goal is to undermine the king. Durst bards. Cronus Ampera. Durst bards at their best are extravagant singers and poets, hungry for attention and always willing to raise spirits. They see the world for what it is. Their goal is to tease the king. At their worst, Durst bards weaponize their wits and lay traps. They're masters of the court and know the 48 rules of power by heart. Their ultimate goal is to overtake the king's court. Prospect thieves. Example, Vriska Circuit. Prospect thieves at their best are incorrigible spirits working outside the law to do what they believe is right. They're singularly potent and precise, and their influence cannot be ignored. Their ultimate goal is to take the king's riches. At their worst, prospect thieves are slighted and wounded by the social order and cannot tell a valid target from an innocent bystander. They hurt everyone. Their goal is to leave the king penniless. Durst thieves. Example, Mina Pisces. Durst thieves at their best are charismatic and sly, though too blunt to be true tricksters. They don't care if they're doing something wrong, and they often look out for their own, even if it might sink them. Their goal is to live apart from the king. Durst thieves at their worst are slighted, betrayed villains. They do not believe in an eye for an eye. They believe in a life for an eye. Their ultimate goal is to assassinate the king. Inversions are an essential part of class spectating, and the real meat of most class systems that exist. The issue is, everyone seems to have a different idea of what inversion is, only that class has some relation to the Jungian notion of the shadow. It's implied by Calliope that each class has a counterpart, but it's difficult to tell the intended counterparts other than the ones Calliope specifically states. Each system that attempts to establish class pairs comes to different conclusions. In Dewdrop's class spec brochure, Draft 17, there is an extensive section in how certain classes can appear similar. They refer to this as the rubber band stretching before snapping back, and while they mean that one shouldn't misdiagnose their class spec, I take a slightly different meaning. All classes interact internally in various ways, through certain similarities between them. For instance, rogues and thieves are very similar in that they both steal. Heirs and pages are both defined by their potential in some way. Similar themes emerge from many different classes, or as I would argue, all classes. Unlike aspects which have vague, almost unknowable characters, classes have specifically and broadly overlapping character. The difference between, say, a witch and a mage could be as general as a gender difference or a preference of terms. Limiting symmetry to only pairs of active-passive members limits the analysis in what I hope is an obvious way. Why should there only be one class who is the opposite to a certain other class? The idea of a class inversion reflects the Jungian notion of the conscious and unconscious, the persona and the shadow. It also reflects the Gnostic ideas of the spiritual and material worlds, splitting a self into a mundane body and divine inner spark. There's been a great deal of moralizing regarding these notions, in that the shadow is often conceptualized as foreign or immoral, and the material world is seen by the Gnostics as illusory and transient. But ultimately these notions point to two different selves, the self we know and the self we do not. In us, there is a conscious spark which constitutes all of the conscious willpower we have control over. Our hands, our voice, our eyes, all of these are controlled by our willpower and desires. There is, however, a deeper unconscious part of us that controls our subconscious processes, such as blinking and breathing and becoming hungry. Think of these as the body self and the mind self. Each one is us in that our body and mind are both our own, and they are not independent, but they are different. The mind self is what can be understood as having a class aspect as we imagine it, a class and an aspect someone uses in order to change the world, the lens through which they see things. However, there is also the body self's class aspect, which could be understood as the inversion, a class and aspect that take charge when we attempt to suppress our needs and instincts. These often express themselves violently and angrily in times of distress, fear, and rage. When Rose Lalonde lashes out, she is acting with her body self. She is acting at the will of her suppressed shadow. When Dirk Strider, fearful and angry, cracks the lenses of Hal, his brother, he is acting in his frightened body self. In these moments, the subject acts out of step with how we might expect a scion of their class to do. A prince does not fear or doubt. A seer does not fight and rage. In these moments, we see other powers and abilities manifest themselves, and must be understood as expressing a different class and aspect. In simpler terms, everyone has a class as well as an inversion as posited by Calliope. The way this analysis differs is that there could be many more ways to express these inversions than one direct inverse. A seer's inverse could sometimes act as a witch, but it could act as any class. A prince's inverse could be a page, but it need not be. Discovering your own shadow is not an easy process. If it were, there would be no industry for analytical psychology. As such, trying to assign yourself an inverse class aspect is a very difficult process. We should also not conceive of these inverses as malignant or bad, because doing so would lead to further self-loathing and fear. That said, inversions usually only manifest during genuine moments of strife or as a person's worst instincts and fears. Suppressed desires, such as strong characters wishing secretly to be comforted, kind characters wishing secretly to be cruel, and willful characters secretly feeling weak and doubtful. The proper attitude to have towards an inversion is to desire discovery and acceptance. To look at yourself and say, maybe I do want to hurt someone. Maybe I do have a feeling I'm ashamed of. Again, if this were easy, therapists wouldn't have jobs. This is also not to say that your dark impulses are correct, nor should be indulged, just acknowledged and not suppressed or shamed. In the following section, I will list the nefarious tendencies of each class, and define how it could be a shadow over your ego. The inverted lord is a tyrant, cruel and wicked, desiring power for its own sake. The inverted lord is felt by the powerless and the powerful, those who want to see others bow before them. To reconcile the inverted lord is to accept your desire for power as endemic to human life, and to allow your inner lord to relish the power you have over others without abusing them. The inverted muse is a lazy pillow princess, wishing for all of their needs to be met by devoted, thankless servants. They are a lounging goddess in the mind. They want to be served and give nothing back in return. To reconcile the inverted muse is to accept your desire for comfort and peace as endemic to human life, and allow your inner muse to savor every moment of lazy indulgence without wallowing. The inverted witch is vengeful and sinister, wishing vindictive harm upon others. Curses, hexes, all manner of foul fortune must befall the inverted witch's enemies. The inverted witch is hatred incarnate. To reconcile the inverted witch is to accept your own deep despisal of others and to savor that hatred without succumbing to it. Let it pass through you. The inverted rogue is the self-righteous kleptomaniac. Heart heavy with greed, the rogue takes first and justifies it to themselves later. They want what others have, sometimes foes, but often friends. They desire material wealth and will take it. To reconcile the inverted rogue is to accept that you have envy for those you love and savor material wealth and prosperity. The inverted heir is a crying baby, the immature spirit desiring comfort. The inverted heir feels an impossible-to-fill pit in their heart that draws on care and comfort. They desire things that are familiar and fearful of leaving whatever womb they've embedded themselves in. To reconcile the inverted heir is to acknowledge one's own lack and sate it without shame or without succumbing to it. The inverted seer is a sharp-tongued gossip who sees all and probes into affairs that do not concern them. They savor information like food and redistribute it in hushed tones. The inverted seer cannot help but stir the pot and gossip. To reconcile the inverted seer is to acknowledge a passion for gossip and to savor the juicy secrets when they are found. The inverted mage is wrathful, angry, and furious being. Anger and rage for its own sake, a raise of blood pressure and addiction to being self-righteous. Any excuse to shout at someone is a good excuse to the inverted mage. To reconcile the inverted mage is to take proper pleasure in anger and to enjoy it, thus taking away its edge. The inverted maid is a servile, submissive being, a desire to serve others, to be dominated and abused by them, a sick, twisted pleasure, and a tendency to find and appease broken people. The inverted maid has a trail of horrible exes who they cannot stop calling. To reconcile the inverted maid is to accept existential masochism and indulge in safe versions of those desires. The inverted knight is a sadistic and coldly cruel existence. A scoffing superiority to others, a sense that you are the only one who has it together. A tendency to treat others like fools, and to hold yourself above them, to serve them through condescension. To reconcile the inverted knight is to accept and appreciate the ways you are superior without becoming deluded. The inverted sylph is a fussing and uncomfortable xenophobe, an intense, burning suspicion of anything different, a passionate resistance to change of any kind. The inverted sylph is stuck in their ways and cannot escape their own squalor. To reconcile the inverted sylph is to acknowledge and enjoy routine and ritual without fearing your own boundaries. The inverted page is helpless and childish, immature and stupid. The inverted page hates learning, hates anything new, and indulges its most id-driven desires like food, games, and pleasure. It cannot be reasoned with and stands in the way of any ambition, accepting its lowly place. To reconcile the inverted page is to enjoy your pleasures and savor hedonism without succumbing to it. The inverted prince is envy and jealousy honed to a fine, subtle point. To those who despise others and wish to take from them. To climb high is not enough. Others must be knocked down. Grudges never leave the inverted prince. To reconcile the inverted prince is to accept ambition and to disregard comparisons to others, but to still savor their foibles. The inverted bard is sadistic and immature. It is the childish desire to tear wings from insects, to abuse those with less power than you like toys, to be smug and self-assured simply by nature of one's own superior station. The sadism of the powerful, a lack of care for the weak. To reconcile the inverted bard is to enjoy your power and to savor superiority without letting cruelty enter your heart. The inverted thief is the inflated ego, the self-love that crosses into worship. The thief loves the sound of their own voice and the fact that they have everything all figured out. Blind and deaf, they love only their own reflection. They never apologize and never regret. To reconcile the inverted thief is to love your own face in the mirror or your own words on the page while foregoing disdain for others. The question hanging over all class-spec analysis is, of course, how can I insert myself and my favorite characters into this system? I said before that a class cannot be diagnosed in the way we currently imagine it, but we can still apply these labels to ourselves and others, like masks a performer wears for a play. If you were in a band or choir, before you began to sing or play, someone likely asked you to select an instrument or a range. This question, like many questions in life, are criterionless. In other words, they are impactful decisions that will help shape your future that you have no way of comprehending when these questions are asked. As such, these selections can be made with spurious reasoning and tenuous details. When I was young, I chose to play the trombone because it was the one that looked the silliest, and the instructor told me that since you're tall, you'll be able to control it better. I spent the next 10 years of my life dedicated to an instrument that I chose on what was essentially a whim. Others in my band class chose even more spurious selections, things that suited them, things that didn't. Some students already had an instrument selected since they got private lessons from their parents. Whatever the case, a choice was made, and we worked to become more skilled at an instrument, not because it was ideal for us, but because it was the one we chose. An arbitrary choice that was committed to. In many ways, this criterionless choice is the one must make when selecting for themselves a class. Each class exists as something mysterious and impenetrable, a vague archetype colored by only other examples of those who have chosen those archetypes. The question, which class are you, is the question, which class do you want to be, expressed through a limited set of 14 pre-existing classes. The way to select a class is the same way that you would try on a piece of clothing or try on a new skill. It must be attempted without experience and naivete. It must be tried on like a mask, and skill must be built in it before you can judge it. You select one and become slowly changed by it, and discover if you've changed into someone you like. This is all essentially to say, you can just pick. Unlike aspect, which is a deeper and more varied analytical form, class is a set of archetypes that to some extent anyone could embody. In different parts of your life, you have probably felt Prince-like or Page-like, and if you haven't, you can at least empathize with the emotions of someone Witch-like or Seer-like. We understand these drives, we understand these emotions, they exist within us in a template in our genome. The idea of a mage or an heir is a shorthand, descriptive title existing before Homestuck, long before. They are patterns experienced in real life, overlaid on fantasy and fiction to construct a narrative. This is somewhat of a hot take, but while most analysts seem to understand classes as something specific, classes are not so direct. They are subtle and varied, subject to a person's own personal opinions on the roles they choose for themselves. Or put in another way, some trombonists become fine chamber musicians, and some become jazz artists, but they are all trombonists. A class can be identified and assigned essentially arbitrarily. Not much evidence is required. Evidence can be anything from a linguistic flourish to the weapon the character uses to the color coding present. What are you trying to be? What is the character trying to be? Let's change our thinking here. What is a cat? A cat, of course, is a four-legged mammal with sharp ears. A good enough definition, but that description also defines a fox, does it not? What about a four-legged mammal with a short nose with sharp ears? Well, perhaps, but some cats have blunt ears. In this way, linguistic definition is actually very difficult to accomplish. Cat is a broad category, which a singular definition doesn't fit over. It's not hard to do this with any class of thing. Chairs, tables, dogs, trees, all of these things have categories that are recognized not using specific sets in and of themselves, but recognition and association. Put more simply, you know these things when you see them. There is no calculus to be done to identify a cat. You recognize it without hesitating. Therefore, a class of things can be understood not as a cluster of definitions, but something you build your skills in recognizing. How is this skill built? By inspecting members of a class and figuring out what they have in common, so one can figure out how to spot more in the future. For instance, most trees have leaves, most trees have bark, most trees are tall, most trees burn. Not all trees have all these traits, but seeing a plant with bark and leaves, we can see a tree. Or seeing a plant with leaves without tallness, we might re-identify as a bush. Earlier in this piece, I have identified all canonical examples of members of certain classes, but we can go further. In myth and stories, there are examples of seers and mages that we can use to further figure out just what it is meant by these things. Let's build a better understanding of each class through mythological and historical example. Lords. Lords in myth and media are singularly dominant. Characters say "my lord" to refer to their masters, and the title Lord of X is bestowed on figures that are supreme in some fashion. Lord is a status requiring great respect and fear. Lord is used to refer to gods and goddesses, notably God the Father of the Old Testament, a feared and revered deific being. Muse. Muses in myth are seductive and consuming as well as sexual. When a character refers to something as being their muse, they mean that character is inspiring and captivating in a singular fashion. Muse is derived from the Greek musa, and then the Latin musa, meaning a deity who inspires. Inspirational and captivating figures are associated with the divine. If God the Father is a lord, the God the Holy Spirit is a muse, inspiring and suffusing followers' lives. Mage. Mages in myth are associated with magic and wisdom. Other terms meaning mage are the plural magi, and the archaic magus. The three wise men in the New Testament Bible are referred to as the magi in some translations. Magi are sometimes mystical, often reclusive, and always learned. The owl is a common symbol of wisdom and solitary nature. Yoda and Gandalf are examples of mages, characters with great power and a tendency towards solitude. Seer. Seers are common figures in ancient Hellenic history, both in myth and their real lives as an occupation. The oracle at Delphi is a famous example. Oracles are not the only example, as seeing has been used to mean future sight with figures like Odin from Norse tradition, and Moirai in Hellenic tradition. Seers are obscure and odd, represented by the Norns and the Moirai. Other examples include Cordelia Chase from Angel, who sees visions of future tragedy, and Imhotep, the 3rd millennium BC chancellor and mythological god.
Witches are often marginalized in modern media, from the Salem witches to the Wicked Witch from Oz, even though Glinda calls herself a witch too. Witches are associated with femininity and nature, strong and weirding women who are often maligned but just as often resorted to in times of trouble for cures and ailments. In Arthurian myth from the Anglo-Saxon tradition, the witch Morgan Le Fay is a figure of great power and uneasy evil. Ravens and other corvids are associated with witches. Joseph from the Bible is an example of a more masculine witch, a man who has mysterious powers bestowed by God, who is often wrathful.
Heir. The term heir is still used today, as is inheritance, from which the name comes. Heirs inherit fortunes and sometimes do not deserve these gifts, but often grow into ownership. Heir in Homestuck also has some wordplay with air, as in the air we breathe. King Arthur is a classic example of an heir, a boy who pulls the sword from the stone and inherits the title of king. Heirs are associated with kings and other kingly symbols, like the lion and crown. Luke Skywalker, though not a king, inherits his father's gifts and must grow over the course of the films. Knight. A knight summons very direct associations in the Western world. Armored fighters, usually from the Renaissance and Middle Ages, who defended kings. Knights could also be understood as soldier, and could refer to many different soldier archetypes, such as Japanese samurai and Roman legionaries. Swords are a heavy symbol across all cultures, or, in more modern times, guns. Weaponry used to defend rather than to conquer. Knights and samurai also have a strict code that members rely on. The knight Lancelot from Arthurian legend, Don Quixote from the literature of Cervantes, and even mythological figures like the gargoyle use physical violence to defend.
Page. Often related to the knight, a page is understood as a knight in training. Training and potential are heavily emphasized. The page stands out among the classes as it's the only seemingly explicitly transitory class. Pages don't stay pages in media. Pages are also associated with foibles and mischief, often clumsy. Still, they often are positioned to see past the institutional dogma, unlike their betters. Goku, especially in early Dragon Ball, is an example of a page, a trainee. Paul Atreides is also a page, someone who reaches for and in some ways fails to reach his potential. A more esoteric example of a page's devious side is Sisyphus, tricking Thanatos and Persephone.
Thief. Thieves loom large in media. They are outlaws of any stripe that does not immediately discount sympathy, anything from pirates to the gentleman thieves like Arsène Lupin and the Scarlet Pimpernel. Thieve is a synonym to steal, and as such we could also consider Prometheus, the stealer of fire, to be a thief, but the line between rogue and thief is very thin. A more solid example of the thief is Dracula, a man who must drink blood to survive. Wolves and other devious hunters are often associated with these tricksters. Rogue. Rogues and thieves are almost the same, but the primary difference is the selfishness and earnestness. Thieves are outlaws because they are avaricious. Rogues are outlaws because they cannot countenance the social order. Robin Hood is the most classic example, giving to the poor and stealing from the rich. Roguish good looks is a common phrase referring to the confidence and slyness of a rogue. Rogue in more commonplace parlance often refers to any charming outlaw. Foxes are associated with rogues. Maid. Servants of any kind could be associated with maids. Butlers, handmaidens, manservants, or even a caddy. Maids serve and do it dutifully, usually admiring their masters to some degree. Who would Jeeves be without Wooster? Maids have a dark side, though. And when their master goes astray, they are not above admonishing and even punishing them. Not always submissive, but always reliable. Not all maids are explicitly servants. Bulma, in Dragon Ball, invents and uses ingenious inventions to serve her more powerful and capable friends. There are numerous helpful fae and sprites who serve, such as the story of the cobbler. Maids also have some wordplay in Homestuck with made, as in being made of something. Sylph. Sylph, or sylphid, is an arcane term, perhaps more than any other class term. Sylph is rather vague, referring in folklore to a spirit inhabiting a dead body, or a spirit of the air, but they are usually transient ghosts. In Homestuck, they are understood as healers, but more accurately, they have an association with alchemy, due to the writings of Paracelsus. Sylphs are supernatural and mysterious, and usually benevolent. Jesus Christ in many ways reflects the Homestuck conception of the sylph as a mysterious fae-like healer. Osiris of Egyptian myth could also be understood as a sylph, the god of the dead who works in subtle ways. Prince. Most directly, the prince is the son of the king. Princes are understood as dominant, but also slightly childish and inexperienced. There are many princes from myth and real princes. Thor, son of Odin, the naive god and hero. Hercules, son of Zeus, mighty hero with a lot to prove. Zeus himself is something of a prince, and often an immature king, son of despot Cronus. Princes in Homestuck don't denote royalty, but the chip shoulders and dominance remain. Bard. We all know Bard from Dungeons and Dragons, the fun musician class with creative spells and interesting interactions. Bards through history and myth are storytellers and weavers of narrative. Bards like Orpheus, who sing so beautifully and inspire others. Gods like Kvasir of the Norse tradition of poetry and wisdom. Bards as an occupation marry the mundane with the transcendent, the bridge between myth and people. They're heavily associated with music and art, as well as eccentricism. The amount that classes and their names associate with real-world examples of their names is unclear in Homestuck. For example, John is called an heir, but his father is just kind of a regular guy. John does inherit things from his dad, like the shaving cream in his car, but I doubt we would call him an heir in the common parlance. If we were to attribute a more modern archetype on John, it might be something like nerd or geek, since he's into computers and games and whatnot. Class, then, does not have a direct relationship with these archetypes, more like a vague association, based on how they act in a story. The last video in this series, the video on classspects, taken together, will discuss this more in depth. For our purposes, we can just say that a class is more subjective, broadly speaking. If these classes are so subjective, then could there possibly be other classes? Broadly, other theorists are open to this idea, with Dewdrop in particular codifying a few in their analysis. In Homestuck itself, there are actually other canonical classes, such as Gent, embodied by the unnamed Spurb player Nana speaks to, and Waste, the class Andrew Hussey assigned himself. As such, I don't think it's very far-fetched to say there could be other classes and other associations that could be constructed, but this analysis is going to be limited to a discussion of the main 14. This flexibility is another reason the geometric passive-active dichotomy is difficult for me to accept. The 14 classes in Homestuck being embodied by more than one character each, except for the Cals, implies to me that each class is a baseline class and is exhaustive in the way that it defines the spectrum of possible classes. In simpler terms, the main 12 are the normal classes, with Lord, Muse, Waste, Gent, etc. existing outside of this, with Muse and Lord being the master classes from which the others spring. Class and aspect have now been discussed in exhaustive detail. I've taken them apart one after the other, like this, in this order, so that I might explore them in their own existence, but there remains one part that has been unspoken. Class and aspect are not independent of each other in the comic of Homestuck, nor in most analysis. Therefore, the next and final part in this series is going to be a video about classpect as a unit, how one informs the other, and the all-consuming question, which classpect are you? This video began with a thorough explanation of what class is, what writing exists about it, and finally my own new thoughts and opinions. The aspect video was heavily themed around music, but this class portion doesn't have any one particular theme emerge of that nature. Class seems to have more to do with society and archetypes than any vague metaphor that I could construct. This material, though somewhat pretentious and heady, is not made only for myself, of course. This knowledge has the ability to open doors into the self that could not be opened by aspect alone. Do you see yourself differently now that a broader picture of class has been drawn? What vices do you see in yourself after discussing inversions? Hopefully, you've reached a new conclusion and a better picture of who you are through viewing pictures of others. That is the human condition, after all. Alright, that's all I have to say until next time. If you'd like to spread the word or support me in my future endeavors, please do so at patreon.com. My blog is hosted for free on Patreon, so there is plenty of free stuff available outside of the paid benefits. Thanks for watching.